Since the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, took power, the growing and systematic religious persecution in China has generated tens of thousands of refugees who flee to democratic countries. The mere fact that refugees are granted asylum declares to the world that China is guilty of religious persecution. As the CCP has always presented itself as great, glorious, correct, how can it admit the fact that it persecutes religious belief and tramples on human rights? For this reason, the CCP has launched a long-term, systematic, and massive campaign to harass refugees who flee religious persecution in China. The first strategy used by the CCP is to use the manipulation or corruption of some foreign journalists and scholars to spread fake news that defames the religious groups persecuted by the CCP. As the pretext on which the CCP wantonly persecutes these religious groups, the fake news had already widely spread in China. Uyghur Muslims were accused of being terrorists, and false accusations of violence were directed against Falun Gong and others. The rumors and false accusations by the CCP have caused further hurt to the refugees fleeing religious persecution. In 2005, a young Uyghur physics graduate called Burhan Zunin, 1977 to 2005, committed suicide in Denmark after being denied asylum in this country and previously in Germany and Norway. The Church of Almighty God, CAG, has also been deeply harmed by the CCP's fake news. In 2014, the CCP accused the CAG of the murder of a woman in a McDonald's diner in Shaoxuan, a crime in fact committed by a different, small religious movement. CAG refugees encountered many difficulties in seeking asylum. Some of them, after receiving departure orders, tried to return to China in secret, but were arrested, sentenced, and tortured. The CCP also exported its physical persecution abroad. It imposed pressure on democratic countries through political, economic, and diplomatic channels. And moreover, its agents started operating abroad, threatening refugees and using different strategies to prevent them from obtaining asylum. The CCP has used these methods against almost all persecuted groups fleeing overseas, where it recruited local fellow travelers. A case in point is Korean pro-CCP activist Ms. Oh Myung-ok, who launched campaigns against both Falun Gong and the CAG in South Korea. Ms. Oh runs a website and a publishing house, denouncing groups she does not like as heretics. Suspiciously, she particularly focused on groups persecuted by the CCP. She preaches that there is no persecution in China and demands that the Korean government deport these religious refugees. Unfortunately, there are a handful of misguided Christians supporting her, confusing theology and human rights. It is normal that religious groups disagree between themselves about theology. It is not normal that Christians support persecution, torture, and murder by an atheistic communist regime of believers whose theology they do not like. International scholars have studied the systematic and decade-long harassment by China of Tibetan Buddhist refugees who escaped to Nepal since the 1950s. In 1989, due to continuous Chinese pressure, Nepal stopped allowing Tibetan refugees to settle permanently in the country. However, it continued to permit their safe passage to India after having signed an agreement with the United Nations to that effect. China, however, continued to harass Tibetan refugees in Nepal. Since the mid-1990s, Nepal has stopped Tibetan Buddhist refugees at the border and deported some of them back to China. A Nepalese official stated that the level of Chinese pressure against Tibetan refugees was so high that Nepal had no capacity to fight back against this pressure. China tried to interfere with the life of Tibetan refugees in the West as well, although Western governments were better equipped to resist.
We have about 200 Tibetan people living in Sweden. And then one Tibetan was found spying on other Tibetans. Swedish government, for a long time looked after him, and then they have all the evidence that he was receiving money from Chinese government and then doing all this espionage. So he was charged and put in jail.
China has also tried to prevent Uyghur Muslims from obtaining political asylum abroad. This strategy worked for many years. In addition to the CCP's denying any persecution in Xinjiang and depicting the Uyghurs as terrorists, the CCP also imposes economic pressure and intimidation upon Uyghur refugees. In December 2009, for example, Cambodia deported back to China 20 Uyghur asylum seekers. The local government admitted Chinese pressures. The Uyghurs were deported only one day before the then Chinese Vice President Xi Jinping visited Cambodia and promised economic help of $1 billion. Later, that Uyghurs were persecuted became evident, and Chinese propaganda was no longer believed, at least in democratic countries. Some Uyghurs were granted asylum, but this did not stop CCP's persecution against them. They received death threats against themselves and their children, and mysterious phone calls at night, and had their cars damaged or the windows of their homes smashed. Senator Marco Rubio, co-chair of the Congressional Executive Commission on China, stated in 2018 that the long arm of the Chinese government directly impacts the broader Uyghur diaspora community, including in the United States. This is unacceptable. This was, however, not the worst. As the New York Times titled on October 18, 2018, Uyghur Americans speak against China's internment camps. Their relatives disappear. Uyghur refugees are warned by Chinese agents that if they do not keep silent on the persecution, their relatives living in China will be detained and may even be killed. Unfortunately, these are not vain threats.
They've been told, you must come back so that your family will be well treated. And yet they know that anyone who has a tie abroad, that is Uyghurs who've been in Europe or America, if they go back, they can easily be taken directly from the airport into indefinite secret detention in a camp. So they're put in an impossible bind.
China also keeps Muslim ethnic Kazakhs in the transformation through education camps. Some of them manage to escape to Kazakhstan, where Chinese agents and fellow travelers try to intimidate them and to pressure authorities not to grant them asylum. A national and international mobilization helped a brave Kazakh judge rule in 2018 that the most vocal of these asylum seekers, a woman called Saila Guli Sawutabai, should not be deported back to China. But she was not granted asylum and reported that she and her children, who were also in Kazakhstan, were openly threatened by Chinese agents and pro-CCP Kazakhs when they walked on the street. She left Kazakhstan at the beginning of June 2019, seeking asylum in Sweden. The well-known human rights lawyer representing both Sawutabai and other Chinese refugees, Iman Umarova, often receives death threats, and under CCP pressure, the head of the largest human rights organization in Kazakhstan, Zerikzan Bilash, was placed under house arrest after he supported refugees from China. Several secret CCP documents, including one published in 2017 by the Henan CCP Provincial Committee, describe in detail how refugees from groups labeled as Xijiao, including Falun Gong and CAG, should be systematically monitored, spied, and harassed abroad. CAG refugees are being spied on and persecuted by the CCP in several countries. Again, this persecution has been and remains particularly severe in South Korea. On May 18, 2016, the wife of a CAG refugee in South Korea, Jung Fu, brought their child to Jeju Island to look for him. Traveling together with her was a CCP agent. At the behest of the agent, Jung's wife trapped him in a hotel, secretly took his passport, snatched his wallet, credit cards, and money, and tried to intimidate him into returning to China with her. The CCP agent even pursued him to Jeju Island Airport and sought to forcibly kidnap him back to China. In the end, Jung managed to make a thrilling escape. Bitter Winter has published confidential documents where the CCP organized and coordinated campaigns to have CAG refugees in South Korea deported back to China. Ms. Oh, whom we already met, was the main fellow traveler the CCP used for these projects. On September 6, 2016, her magazine, Religion and Truth, illegally released detailed personal information of dozens of CAG Chinese refugees in South Korea, including photographs taken from their passports. How Ms. Oh managed to obtain this information is unclear. On October 8, 2016, Ms. Oh and a handful of supporters staged a spontaneous demonstration outside the CAG premises in Guro, Seoul. This false demonstration was repeated several times in November 2017. Several relatives of CAG members were persuaded and forced to come to South Korea by China's National Security Bureau and asked their family members to come back to China. Between August 30 and September 4, 2018, Ms. Oh took 11 relatives of CAG members who had been taken to Korea from China by National Security Bureau agents to demonstrate in Jeju Island and Seoul, requiring their family members to come back home and asking the Korean government to repatriate them. Of course, by returning to China, these refugees would not go back home, but to jail. They explained this calmly to their relatives, some of whom admitted they had been pressured by the CCP to come. Happily, Austrian journalist and human rights activist Peter Zohr was coincidentally visiting the CAG during the false demonstrations and documented the events. They ended in disgrace and were the subject matter of a successful documentary movie by Bitter Winter, The Hoax. However, the CCP in China continued to harass relatives of CAG members in Korea, recruiting them for missions to Seoul where they should persuade their family members to go back to China. New false demonstrations started being planned in 2019, as usual with the help of the indefatigable Ms. Oh. Not all relatives were persuaded, though. The son of a female member of the CAG in Korea came from China in 2019 with an unusual message: "Mom, don't come home."
上个月我儿子来看我，
Last month,
他说
my son paid me a
去年
visit.
当地公安局
He said last year he was called to the National Security Brigade of a local public security bureau for investigating my face in
他
Almighty
通过在
God
公安局内
abroad.
部的一个朋友打电话，
Later, one of his friends serving in the Public Security Bureau
对海外
told
权力
him
审
that the
计
police
部
had a
掌握
good
得
grasp
很清楚
of CAG Christians overseas.
他说
His friend showed him a paper
那个朋友
where there
拿出
was
一张
clear information of a list
上
of
面
people,
有十几个人的信息，
including me. The
其中就
paper
有
included our names,
上面有人
photos,
名
the countries, and
在
the
哪个
churches
国
we were
哪
in,
个教会，
and even the
甚至在教
spiritual
会的名
names we
都
use
非
in the
常清楚。
church. My son said
孩
to
子
me
答应对
worriedly,
我说
Mom, don't return home.
你千万
If
别
you
回家，
do, you'll probably be arrested at the airport.
一入境，可能在机场就有可能被抓。
Falun Gong refugees have also been the target of Chinese persecution. Despite international organization documents acknowledging that Falun Gong is persecuted in China, refugees have been denied asylum and deported back to China from Thailand, Cambodia, Germany, and other countries. In virtually all cases, strong Chinese pressures and fake news played a role in the deportations. Between 2009 and 2011, the CCP imposed pressure on the Korean government, forcing it to deport Falun Gong practitioners. From then on, in no country, the CCP has been more active in reclaiming deportation of Falun Gong refugees than in South Korea, despite international protests. CCP fellow traveler Ms. Oh has played a central role in these campaigns of hate. In 2017, Falun Gong adherent Ms. Ma Hui and her 8-year-old daughter Ma Jing were seized by Russian immigration officers at their St. Petersburg residence and forcibly put on a plane to China, despite having been recognized as bona fide refugees by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees Office in Russia. Their fate in China is unknown. China promotes abroad a Chinese anti-cult world alliance, KPCh. A chapter of KPCh is active in Flushing, New York, which is home to a large Chinese community. It has been sued by members of Falun Gong for a number of illegal activities, including systematic harassment and even violence against refugees. On April 23, 2018, the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of New York ordered the lawsuit to proceed.
And there is another case in Thailand. The gentleman, his last name is Zhang. He ran away from China one day. He go to Thailand. He was hit by a car one day, and it's not serious injury. But after he was sent to a hospital, he died in hospital, and people believe that he might injure something into his body, and so he died in hospital.
The great Italian poet of the 14th century, Dante, 1265 to 1321, proclaimed, "Those who have fled persecution are sacred, and nobody should dare injure them." However, the CCP keeps harassing them in the countries where they live as refugees. These bullying tactics have been repeatedly denounced by respected NGOs and international organizations, including the United Nations, and certainly do not improve the already abysmal reputation China has internationally for its handling of political and religious dissidents. The answer of the free world and of all friends of human rights and religious liberty should be a simple one: support the refugees.